Okay, so the modal argument doesn't start with certain ideas about what Mary, this person in this amazing situation, would think about what she comes to know, or what she would actually come to know. It starts off with you and what you can imagine, what you can conceive of. So let's tell some stories and see if you can follow them, see if you can imagine what I'm talking about. The first story concerns two twins. Call them Angie and Beth. And Angie and Beth are seemingly near identical. They are lovely twins. They behave in very similar ways and so forth. But there's a hidden difference between Angie and Beth. And it's in the way their brains are structured, and the way their vision is structured. And they never discover about this difference throughout their lives. But the difference is always there. And the difference is this. They process colors differently. So, when Angie looks at the sea under a bright noon sky, and she's inclined to describe it as blue, what she sees is just what Beth sees when she looks at blood. And when Angie looks at blood, what she sees is just what Beth sees when she looks at the sea under a bright noon sky. So the way that blood looks to Angie is the way that the sea looks to Beth, and vice versa. Now, why they never discover about this is that they have no external reference point. So all the time, whenever Angie looks at the sea, she says, that's blue. And whenever Beth looks at the sea, she says, that's blue. They never discover that the way it looks to Angie is just not at all the way it looks to Beth. And they never discover this because their brains consistently process this information differently. So I take it that that story was, I mean, it's a little bit funny, but it's a story you were readily able to comprehend and to follow. Okay, so let's take a different story, a story that's level up in terms of strangeness. And that's this. Just like the first story, the way that the sea looks to Angie is the way that blood looks to Beth, and vice versa. So we haven't changed the way these things look to the twins. What we're changing in the stories, though, is the way their brains are structured. This time, their brains are physically just the same. So the neural structure now of Angie's brain is just the same as the neural structure of Beth's brain. If I was to describe Angie's brain using the language of science, it would be the same description, essentially, as the description of Beth's brain using the language of science. It would differ only in the tiniest of details. Again, that seems quite possible. So it seems quite possible that their brains might be, in this respect, physically just the same. The same with respect to features describable in the language of science. And yet the way that things appear to them be very different. Philosophers call this the inverted spectrum thought experiment, because it's, the idea is Angie's spectrum of color vision is inverted with respect to Beth's, and vice versa. Okay, so if you followed me, let's take this one step further. Let's imagine a world that is physically just like our world. In other words, a world such that if you were to describe it using the language of science, the description would be just the same as the corresponding description for our world. And yet, the experiences of people in this world we're imagining are inverted with respect to our own. The color experiences are inverted with respect to our own. What it's like for you to see blood is just what it's like for the corresponding version of you in this world we're imagining to see the sea under the noon sky. What I see when I look at a rose, the way it is for me to see it, to look at a rose, what I experience, what it's like to be me when I look at a rose, is just what it's like for my corresponding twin in this other possible world to look at a blue flower. I don't know, carnation? Are carnations blue? Bluebell. Some kind of blue flower. Everything's swapped with respect to the way things appear to people in the actual world and this possible world that we're imagining. Insofar as you're able to imagine that, you're able to think of that as a coherent possibility, then you're able to think that, look, there are possibilities that are left open by exhaustive descriptions of the world in the language of science. Because you could describe our world in as much detail as you like using the language of science. And that would leave open whether our world was actually as it is, or our world was as it would be in this other possible scenario. So, seems like, again, this shows that there are features of reality that aren't describable in the language of science. Jackson's second version of the modal argument also involves a thought experiment. The thought experiment this time not involving inverted spectrum twins, but zombies. And when we talk about zombies here, we're not meaning zombies in the Hollywood sense of the term, but zombies in the philosophical sense of the term. And we'll explain what that means. Okay, so the thought experiment has 3 stages, just like the last one. Stage 1, we need a brain-dead person, a true Hollywood zombie. Unfortunately, we have one we made earlier here. Damien is a true Hollywood zombie. He's entirely brain-dead. There is absolutely nothing going on inside there. Why? Well, it's not very complicated. His skull is full of green goo. His brain decayed. The virus ate up his brain, and so it's just full of bubbling liquid. How is he standing there and breathing? Well, I don't know, the virus has managed to take over his nervous system and is sustaining basic vital functioning like that. Okay, so what if I were now to ask you, what is it like to be Damien? What is it like to, what's he seeing? How does it feel to be him right now? Try to imagine being Damien as he is right now. You might rightly respond that that's like being asked what it's like to be the table. There's nothing it's like to be the table because the table's not seeing anything, there's not feeling anything, not hearing anything, and likewise there's nothing it's like to be Damien because he's not seeing, hearing, feeling anything. That's fair enough. Conclusion, something with humanoid form can be such that there's nothing it's like to be him. That was the first stage of our thought experiment, not very controversial. First stages of thought experiments are almost never controversial, they're just leading you in. Okay, second stage. Let's acknowledge that Damien is not a Hollywood zombie. So Damien can think, he has a brain, very like ours, in most respects. Quirky in some, but very like us in most respects. And there he is. So, but, because we're still in our thought experiment, I'm going to say something interesting about Damien. Although all the neurons in his brain are firing just like you'd expect, and although he reacts in much the same way you'd expect to like physical stimuli, although he talks, and although, in conversation with him, he'd seem just like an ordinary human being. And although if asked, he would say, I'm just an ordinary human being just like everybody else. In fact, there's a secret fact about Damien, which is that there's nothing it's like to be him. If you imagine being Damien right now, seeing what he's seeing, feeling what he's seeing, there would be no corrective on your imaginative activity. There's nothing about the world that would make one way to imagine him being right and the other wrong. He's just like the table. Nothing it's like to be him. He doesn't know this, of course. He'll deny it. But it's a fact. He is a philosophical zombie. He's not a Hollywood zombie because his brain is not full of goo. He's not going around looking for brains. But he's a philosophical zombie. Okay. I take it that you can at least follow that story. You probably think it's not true. I hope it's not true. But it might be true. You could imagine how things would have to be in order for it to be true. Everybody else around here is conscious. There's something it's like to be us. But Damien, there's just this exception for him. There's nothing it's like to be Damien. Thanks. Third stage of the thought experiment. Imagine a world where what was true of Damien in the second stage of the thought experiment was true for everybody. So imagine a world just like ours, in all physical respects, all respects that are describable in the language of the natural sciences. So for every little atom floating through space in our world, there's a corresponding little atom floating through space in exactly the same way in this other world. For every person in our world, there's a corresponding person in this other world doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time in exactly the same way. So this world is what we might think of as a physical duplicate of our world. It differs from our world in just one respect. Whereas in our world, there's something it's like to be a conscious creature. In this world, they're all like Damien. There's nothing it's like to be any of the creatures in this world. Sorry, in this other world that we're imagining. So even though in this other world, there's a person who's standing there in front of a camera giving a lecture about zombies on edX and so forth, in this other world that we're imagining, there's nothing it's like to be him. You can imagine being him, and nothing makes your imaginative exercise right or wrong. There's no corrective on your imagination. Jackson says we can imagine the world being like that. And because we can imagine the world being like that, it might have been like that. It represents a genuine possibility that the world might be like that. I mean, we think the world isn't like that, but it could have been like that. It might be like that. So, because the two worlds, this imagined world and our world, are the same with respect to all features that could be described in the language of the natural sciences, and yet differ in some other way, that shows that this other way is a feature of our world. There is a feature of our world that can't be described in the language of the natural sciences. Shows that any description in the language of the natural sciences of our world must be incomplete in that it leaves open the possibility that our world is a world in which there's something it's like to be a conscious creature, and our world is a zombie world. Let's end by putting these new arguments into the canonic form premise, premise, conclusion. Premise 1. We can imagine a world just like our own world with respect to features that are describable in the language of the natural sciences, but in which, in the zombie version of the story, there's nothing it's like to see red, or in which, in the inverted spectrum version of the story, what it is like for people in that world to see red is what it is like for people in our world to see blue. Premise 2. If we can imagine such a world, then it is possible that there might have been such a world. Premise 3. If two possible worlds are different, then they must have different features. Conclusion. There are features of our world that are not describable in the language of the natural sciences. So that's another valid argument. So the issue is going to be whether the premises are true. And in particular, that's going to turn on just what's involved in imagining that a certain story be true. To the extent that which we can imagine these stories to be true, does that commit us to thinking that they represent genuine possibilities, genuinely different ways the world could have been? So what we've done here is we've made a case over the course of this lecture for anti-physicalism, for the idea that the natural sciences can't adequately describe all aspects of reality. And we, ourselves, our conscious experience, play an important role in that argument. So we are, if the argument is correct, we are living, breathing counterexamples to the idea that science is king. What if you want to deny that? What if you're a physicalist? What if you're very attached to the idea that science is indeed king and you want to defend the monarchy? Well, there are responses available to you, and we're going to look at a structured way to respond to these arguments next time.